The fist stopped 1 inch from a 10-year-old boy's nose. Nobody moved. Then the room broke apart, laughing the way a crowd does when it decides something is funny, before it decides whether it's cruel. And the woman who threw that punch turned. Slow. Deliberate. She turned that same grin on the boy's father. A quiet man in stained work clothes, holding a mop. He didn't shout. He didn't step back. He set the trash bag down on the mat, and something about the way he did it made one person in that room stop filming. Because he didn't shift his weight to do it. 30 phones were up. A champion was smiling. 200 more would come on Saturday. And out in the second-to-last row of a freezing parking lot, an old woman watched through fogged glass and felt her own blood run cold, and could not have told you why. 9 days. That's all it took. The captain's voice came through the cabin speakers, and it said my name. Not a seat number, not a row. My name, the whole of it out loud in front of 200 strangers at 30,000 feet. And the woman sitting 11 inches to my left stopped breathing. I want you to hold on to that sound, because I'm going to take you back 90 minutes now to a gray morning in Denver and walk you through every step of how we got there. The sky over the mountains that morning was the color of cold steel. Not silver, not the pretty kind of gray they put on postcards. The other kind, flat and low and patient. The kind of sky that has decided nothing good is happening today and has settled in to watch. My suitcase was small and gray, and old enough that one wheel had developed a voice. It sang on the terminal tile. A thin little sound, sort of embarrassing, and I'd been meaning to replace that bag for 4 years, and had never once gotten around to it. My name is Emmett Thorne. I was 42 years old that morning, and I have never in my life looked like a man on his way to anything important. That's not modesty. That's just the arithmetic of my closet. The coat had made it through 9 winters. 9. It had been restitched at both elbows by a woman named Ilsa, who ran an alteration shop in a strip mall off Colfax, and who charged me $12, and told me both times that I ought to just buy a new one. And both times I said I would, and both times I did not. Because the coat still worked. Because that's the whole reason a thing exists. Because, and this is the part that gets people, I have never once in 20 years walked into a room where what I was wearing was the problem. Not really. When people had a problem with me, the coat was just the thing they pointed at. My laptop had a dent in the lid. Left corner about the size of a thumbprint from a night 3 years ago in a client hangar outside Wichita, when I set the bag on a fuel drum that turned out not to be level. It still ran. It ran beautifully. The dent had nothing whatsoever to do with the machine's ability to do arithmetic, and yet I promise you that in the last 3 years that dent has told more people, more things about me, than my resume ever has. And my phone had a crack in the corner of the screen, running maybe a half-inch diagonal, and I'd been living with it so long I'd stopped seeing it. My eye just went around it. The way your tongue learns to go around a chipped tooth, that was me. That was the entire visual presentation of the man who was about to sit in row 32. Nothing about it suggested that a board of directors was going to hold a vote for me. Here's what I do, and I'll say it fast because the details matter later. For 11 years, I built and tested avionics systems. Real work, physical work. I have spent whole summers folded into the guts of aircraft in places where the metal got so hot at noon that you learn to touch it with the back of your hand first because the back of your hand heals faster. Then 8 years ago, something happened that changed what I did with my life. I'll get to it. Not yet. Now I'm an independent safety and procurement advisor, which is a long gray phrase that means this when a company is about to spend enormous money on technology that people's safety will eventually depend on somebody. Hires me to find out whether the promises hold up. I don't sign contracts. I don't sit on boards. I don't own stock in anybody. What I do is write a report, and the people who sign the contracts read that report before they decide. My phone buzzed while I was still in the security line shoes in one hand, belt looped over my wrist like a man who has done this 600 times. It was Ren, my daughter. 14, 5 words. Are you home by Saturday? Then 3 seconds later, before I could even answer, I have to show you something, and it can't wait. And I stood there in my socks on that cold terminal floor, and I felt the thing I always feel, which is a kind of warm panic. Because it can't wait from a 14-year-old could mean absolutely anything. It could mean she'd gotten a grade back. It could mean she'd died something. It could mean the house was on fire and she was being polite about it. I typed back, I'll be there. Whatever it is, don't let Grandma see it first. She sent a single laughing face, and I put the phone in my coat pocket and told myself I wouldn't look at it again until Seattle. I broke that promise about 2 hours later. I'm glad I did. That's all I'm going to say about my daughter for now. She wasn't part of what happened next, and I have never believed in dragging a child into a room full of adults behaving badly. Gate B14. There was a woman near the window, 80s, easily wearing a lavender cardigan and the kind of sensible shoes you buy when you've made peace with the fact that fashion is over. She had a canvas bag with a Sunday crossword folded on top, and she was trying to hoist it onto her shoulder, and it was not going. I put my suitcase down and I got it up there for her. She said, "Oh, aren't you kind?" In that way older women say it, where it comes out sounding like a small blessing rather than a thank you. Her name was Ruth. She told me that without my asking, the way people do at gates. She was going to Seattle for a granddaughter's wedding, and she had opinions about the fiancé that she was clearly dying to share with somebody. It took about 40 seconds of my life. I want you to remember that it took 40 seconds. Because at some point during those 40 seconds, a woman in a charcoal coat walked around the two of us, around Ruth's canvas bag, around my gray suitcase, around both of our bodies, the way you'd walk around a piece of furniture somebody had left in a hallway. Not rudely. That's the thing. There was no rudeness in it at all. We simply weren't there. Celeste Vantore arrived at gate B14 the way weather arrives. I heard her before I saw her. Her voice was pitched at exactly the volume that fills a room without ever technically being loud. A very specific engineering achievement that, and she was telling someone on the other end of a call that the deck needed to be reordered before wheels up. Her luggage was matched leather with brass at the corners. Her coat cost more than my first car, and I'm including the tires. And the gate agent. I watched this happen. The gate agent straightened her spine without seeming to notice she was doing it. Two of them traded a look, the kind that means that name is on the manifest. She was 51 years old. I'd learn that later. Silver at the temples kept deliberately, because a woman who has fought for 2 decades in rooms full of men does not hide her gray. She deploys it, and she had the unmistakable bearing of a person who has been the most important human being in every room she's entered for 23 years, and who has stopped asking whether that will always be true. Then something happened that I didn't understand until much later. She stopped near the window, maybe 4 meters from me, and she took another call. And her voice changed. Completely. It dropped about 1/3 in volume, and it went soft at the edges, and she said, "Hi, Mom." And then, "No, oh no, I'm at the airport, I've got a second." And then she listened for a long time, 30-40 seconds of just listening, which was not something I'd have thought that woman capable of, and she said, "Did they bring the good blanket?" "The green one, ask Marisol. Marisol knows the one." That was it. That was the whole call. And then she hung up, and I watched her put it back on. I mean that, literally. I watched a human being reassemble herself in about a second and a half. Shoulders, jaw, chin. She reached up and touched her collar with 2 fingers, straightened something that wasn't crooked, and by the time she turned back toward the gate, she was made entirely out of armor again. I remember thinking, I remember thinking nothing else about it at all, which in hindsight was the least perceptive 30 seconds of my entire professional life. Now, she should never have been in that boarding line. I found this out afterward. Her Seattle meeting had been moved up by almost a full day, some scheduling collision on the client side, and by the time her assistant went looking, every seat in the front cabin on every earlier flight was gone. What was left was 1 seat. Row 32, aisle. Next to a man in a 9-year-old coat. I stood up to let her in, and she said nothing. Not the reflexive thank you people give without thinking. Nothing at all. She lowered herself into that seat the way you'd sit down in a waiting room at a place you didn't want to be. And she looked at the tray table in front of her, like it had personally let her down. Her assistant called twice more before the door closed. She answered both times. She did not lower her voice for either. And the cabin around us learned things it had no business learning. She told someone the legal review was a formality. She told someone else that if the client's board wanted a phased rollout, they could want it quietly because the pricing was built on a full commitment, and she had no intention of renegotiating a single line of it. And then she said the number out loud. 240 million. She said it the way a man drops his keys on a bar so you can see the emblem. The woman in the row ahead of us turned her head very slightly. That thing people do when they're pretending not to listen and are listening with their entire body. Celeste noticed. Celeste did not care. And that was the first true thing I understood about her, sitting there with my knees against the seat back. She was not being indiscreet by accident. She wanted that number in the air around her. She wanted it doing work. Because the number was doing something her presence alone could no longer do. I opened my laptop and made myself very small and very quiet, which is a skill I learned early and have never once regretted. I had a maintenance interval reliability table open. Gray, dense, column after column of numbers that would put a normal human being to sleep in about 9 seconds. She took the armrest between us inside the first 4 minutes. Took it entirely. Elbow forearm, the whole territory, the way a country takes a border. I let her have it. Some fights aren't worth the fuel, and I had a very long day ahead of me. Then the door closed, the phones went away, and she looked at my screen for the first time. She studied it the way you study a menu in a language you don't read. Are you a mechanic? There was no cruelty in it yet. Just the flat certainty of a woman sorting the world into useful and not useful. Or do you work at the airport? I told her I did a little consulting work in the industry, which was true, and which was small, and which I chose deliberately because I have learned over 20 years that the size of a description tells you almost nothing about a person, but the size of somebody's reaction to that description tells you nearly everything. She laughed. Not a real laugh. That short exhale through the nose people use when they think they've caught you at something. Consulting, she said. That word does a great deal of heavy lifting these days. I asked her what she meant, though I knew. I mean that half the people who tell me they consult are between jobs and have decided to make it sound like a choice. A small shrug. No offense intended. It's simply what I've observed. None taken, I told her, which was also true. I'd heard that same sentence in a dozen different shapes in a dozen airport lounges I wasn't paying to sit in. Then she turned in her seat, angled toward me, and her curiosity had teeth in it now. She asked my age. I told her. She nodded slowly like something had been confirmed, like a hypothesis had held, and she wanted to know why a man over 40 was flying in the back of an aircraft on a business trip. She said business trip with the smallest amount of doubt underneath it. Just enough room right there under the words for the possibility that I'd made the whole thing up. So I told her the truth. I said, I'm a single father. And I've never been able to find a good reason to pay 4 times as much for 4 hours of my life. The seat gets to Seattle at the same moment as every other seat on the airplane. And something moved in her face. Not sympathy, something closer to appetite, because she'd been handed a category, and she started using it immediately. She asked whether it was hard running a practice with a child at home. She asked whether that limited how far I could travel, how many clients I could carry, how much I could take on. Every question sounded like concern. Every question was a measurement. She wasn't asking about my daughter. She was calculating my ceiling, and she had already decided where it was. I answered in short sentences and kept my eyes on my screen, and I felt the old familiar pull to say more than I should. I didn't. 20 years in rooms full of confident people has taught me exactly one reliable thing. The fastest way to find out what a person truly believes is to give them silence and watch what they choose to fill it with. Celeste Van Torre filled it generously. By the time we finished the taxi and settled into the queue, she had explained her entire philosophy of executive life to me, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor. People who make real decisions, she said, don't buy cheap seats. They buy time. Pleasant. Warm, even. Time is the only resource that can't be manufactured, and anyone who trades 4 hours of their own capacity to save a few $100s has told you exactly what he thinks his hours are worth. She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he doesn't expect the patient to survive. I said I could think of a few people who bought time and still found ways to waste it. She smiled at that, the way you smile at a child who has said something charming and beside the point. And then she went further. And this is the part that stayed with me longest. She said she understood, truly understood, why a man in my position would think the way I did. Because fatherhood forces a choice. You either chase the thing you might become, or you protect the small, stable thing you already have. And most men in my situation choose stability. And then she said they tell themselves it was wisdom. She'd watched it happen to several promising people on her own staff. It wasn't a criticism, she said. It was simply the arithmetic of a life. I want to be precise here, because it matters. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crude. There was no moment you could point to and call it an insult. She was doing something much more corrosive than that. She was treating a man's entire life as a case study in limitation, while sitting 11 inches away from him. And there is a kind of contempt that never raises its voice, and it does more damage in 10 minutes than open hostility does in a year, because you can't answer it. There's nothing to answer. There's no sentence in it rude enough to push back against, and if you push back anyway, you're the one who overreacted. So I didn't argue. There is no version of that argument a person wins, and I had zero interest in performing my resume for a stranger. I looked back at my screen, and that was when I saw what she had open on her tablet. A title slide. Clean white background. A word mark I'd been staring at in one form or another for the better part of 3 weeks. Vantore Dynamics. Predictive Failure Architecture. Ground Systems Integration Proposal. I didn't react. Something moved in my chest, because in 8 years of this work I have never once had a coincidence land that squarely. But my face didn't do anything. Faces are trainable. That's a whole skill, and nobody tells you it's a skill. I let 3 full seconds go by. Then I asked her one question, and I asked it in the mildest voice I own. I asked what the false positive rate had come out to, across the full validation series. Her hand stopped on the screen, just stopped. Mid-motion, the stylus an inch off the glass. And for the first time in that entire flight, Celeste Vantore turned and looked at me as a person instead of a category. And what she felt was not respect. It was intrusion. "Excuse me," I repeated it. The false positive rate. The percentage of times the system flagged a component as degrading when the component was in fact entirely healthy. She asked what a consultant flying an economy could possibly know about predictive failure architecture. She asked it lightly, but the lightness had gone thin, the way ice goes thin. I told her I didn't know anything about hers. I said only that in my experience, numbers that come back beautiful are sometimes more worrying than numbers that come back ugly, because an ugly number tells you where to look, and a beautiful number tells you to stop looking. She held my eyes for a moment. Something behind them was working. Then she gave a small shake of her head and reached for the phrase people reach for when they've run out of better ones. "Reading a few technical articles," she said, "doesn't mean you understand a $240 million transaction." I closed my laptop. I didn't close it hard. That's important. I want you to see this exactly as it happened. I simply closed it, and I slid it into the seat pocket in front of me, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I looked forward at the gray plastic bulkhead, and I let the silence sit there between us like a third passenger. She went back to her slides, and out of the corner of my eye, I watched her read the same one 3 times. We turned onto the runway a few minutes later. The engines came up, that long rising note, everything in the cabin leaning back at once, and Captain Delgado came over the speakers with the announcement that every frequent flyer stops hearing after the first sentence. Flight time to Seattle, 2 hours and 41 minutes. Some weather over the Cascades on descent. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. Good voice. Unhurried. The voice of a man who has landed in worse than anything today intends to offer. And then at the very end, it changed. It warmed by about 10 degrees. It slowed down. "One more thing before we go." And there was a pause. A real one. Long enough that the woman in the row ahead of us looked up. "I'd like to send a personal welcome to Emmett Thorne, who's flying with us today." The click of Celeste's stylus against her tablet stopped mid-stroke. "It's very good to have you back on board, Emmett." She turned her head, slowly, maybe 10 degrees. "Some of us up here haven't forgotten." 200 people heard my name, and exactly one of them turned her head. I lifted my chin about an inch. That's what a man does when he's being thanked in front of strangers and wants very badly for it to stop. You don't smile. You don't look around. You give the moment nothing at all to feed on, because attention is a fire, and fires need air. I did not look at the woman beside me. I know what you're thinking, because it's what I would have been thinking, and it's what every single person on that airplane would have been thinking. Look at her. Look at her right now. I didn't. Not out of nobility. If I'm going to tell you this whole thing, I'm not going to be the hero of it. I didn't look at her because I knew that the second I looked at her, this became a contest. And I have watched men win contests like that. They never look the way they think they're going to look. The seatbelt sign went off. 4 minutes. That's how long it took. I know because I was counting, which is a thing I do, which is probably a personality flaw. But here we are. And then the senior flight attendant came down the aisle. She was somewhere past 60. Silver hair pinned back the way women pin it when they've been doing the same job so long, the pins have become part of the uniform. And she had a particular kind of calm on her, the calm of a woman who has worked through decompressions and diversions and 100 bad nights, and has stopped being impressed by turbulence. Her name tag said Marguerite. Everybody who has ever flown with her calls her Margie. I found that out later. She stopped at row 32. She put one hand on the seat back, and she leaned in slightly, and her voice went low, and she said, "Forgive me." When the captain said Emmett Thorne, she stopped, started again. Did he mean the Emmett Thorne from Lantern? I said that he did, and I watched something happen to her face that I was not prepared for. Here's the thing about grown women in their 60s. They do not cry in front of strangers. It is not in the manual. They have buried parents and raised children, and sat in hospital corridors at 3 a.m. holding somebody's coat, and somewhere along the way, they made a decision about what they do and do not do in public. Margie Dunlap did not cry. Her chin moved once. That was the whole tell. "I was on one of them," she said, "and I felt the floor of that airplane drop about 6 inches, which is not a thing floors do." March, 8 years ago, out of Minneapolis. She said the flight number. She said it the way you'd say a birthday. I was working the aft galley. I didn't say anything, because there was nothing. Because what do you say? They pulled us off of the line 11 days later. Her hand tightened slightly on the seat back. Nobody told us why. Not really. Just maintenance advisory aircraft substitution. Please report to crew scheduling. She looked at me. I found out what it actually was 3 years after that. From a mechanic in Detroit who'd had too much to drink at a retirement thing. And then she said the part I have not been able to put down since. I have the technical bulletin in a drawer at my house. The one with your name on the distribution list. A small breath. 38 years I've been doing this. That's the only piece of paper from this job I've ever taken home. I asked her as gently as I knew how not to make anything more of it. She understood immediately. That's the thing about women like Margie. You never have to explain twice. She straightened up. She gave me one small nod, the kind that closes a door quietly. And she went on with the beverage service, like nothing had happened at all. Coffee. Ginger ale. Do you want the whole canjon? 2 rows up a man asked her for extra ice. She got him extra ice. Celeste Vantore had not moved. I mean that literally. She had not moved in something like 90 seconds. The tablet was still in her lap. The stylus was still an inch off the glass. And I could feel her there beside me, the way you feel a storm front, that pressure change, that thing your body knows before your brain gets the memo. Now, I want to slow down here because this is the part everybody gets wrong. That moment was not the twist. The captain saying my name was not the reveal. Because all it did, all it possibly could have done, was tell her that the man she'd spent 40 minutes pitying was known by name to a flight deck and remembered by a crew. It didn't tell her what I did. It didn't tell her why. It didn't tell her that I was flying to the exact same building she was flying to. All it did was break the category. And a broken category is the most uncomfortable thing you can hand to a person who organizes the entire world by rank. Because now she had a man beside her who did not fit anywhere. He wasn't maintenance. He wasn't nobody. He was some third thing, and she had no drawer for a third thing. What unsettled her more, and I know this because she told me hours later in a corridor when neither of us had anything left, was what I did next. Which was nothing. I didn't turn to her. I didn't offer the modest little explanation that's designed to be repeated. You know the one. Oh, it was a while ago. It was really a team effort. The false humble version, which is just bragging, that's learned to wear a cardigan. I didn't say the sentence. The one that begins with actually. The one every single part of her was braced to hear. I took my laptop back out of the seat pocket. I opened the same gray reliability table, and I kept reading. Because there is no counterattack in this world that costs a proud person more than the discovery that you were never going to attack at all. She sat with that for the length of a beverage cart, and I could feel the shape of her beside me. Her breathing changed twice. Then we leveled off. The engines dropped into that long, steady hush that makes people go quiet on airplanes. Somebody's window shade went down. The cabin lights dimmed by a third, and Celeste did something I had half expected. She opened a different folder. I heard the taps, 4 of them. Then a scroll, and she started going backward through her own documentation. Not the presentation, not the deck. She'd been polishing for a week, but the underlying file. The version her legal team had assembled months earlier, and that she almost certainly had not read all the way through, because chief executives don't read appendices. Appendices are what they hire people to read. I did not look over. I didn't have to. Because I knew what was in the back of that file. Because I had written a portion of it. There's a section in there. It's dull. It's the dullest possible section. It lists external parties and review obligations, and it's the kind of page a person's eyes slide right off of. And in that section, there is one line. Independent technical review to be conducted by E. Thorne. Findings submitted to the board prior to authorization vote. 12 words. That's it. That's the whole thing. She read it, and I heard her stop breathing for about a second and a half. Which is a very specific sound when you're sitting close enough to feel the fabric of somebody's sleeve. She remembered then. She told me this later, and I believe her because it was not a flattering thing to admit. The previous winter, her general counsel had mentioned in a meeting that the airline intended to bring in an outside advisor for the technical evaluation. And she'd waved it off inside of a minute. Procedural, she'd called it. Box checking. The kind of thing large carriers do, so their insurers sleep better at night. She had never asked for a name, because names of that kind had never mattered to her. And because in 23 years of experience, the people who wrote reports worked for the people who read them. The questions started about 10 minutes later, and they came in a completely different register. What takes you to Seattle? Work, I said. Do you know anyone there, personally, I mean? Some people, I said. And then, in a voice that had discovered warmth, the way a desert discovers rain. What was lantern? I gave her enough and not one syllable more. A system integrity issue. Years ago. I was part of the team that found it and closed it. Part of the team. Everything worth doing is done by teams, I said. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. And she laughed. And this laugh was different from the first one. This one was working. Then she started building a bridge, in real time, right there in row 32. And I have to tell you, it was fascinating to watch. It was also a little sad, and I mean that without any cruelty at all. She told me that Vantore Dynamics was always looking for experienced people with real operational depth. She said the industry was full of theorists and starving for practitioners. She offered to introduce me to 2 executives whose names she clearly expected to land on me like weather. And then she said that if I ever wanted a conversation about something more permanent, a structure, she called it, with a compensation package that reflected what a man, with my history, was actually worth, her door was extremely open. I let her finish. I let her get all the way to the end of it. Then I asked her one question, and I kept my voice as flat and as unarmed as I could make it. 10 minutes ago, I was a man who traded ambition for stability. She stopped. And now I'm a practitioner with real operational depth. Nothing. Which one is it? Her mouth opened, and nothing came out of it. For a genuine, measurable moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3, which does not sound like much until you have sat 11 inches from someone while it happens. Then she said something about first impressions being an imperfect instrument, and something about how the pace of her life sometimes made her blunt, and something about how she had meant no disrespect. It was not an apology. It was a renovation, because she was not sorry for what she had said. She was sorry about who she had said it to, and those 2 things live in entirely different houses. I told her I understood, and I did. That's the part people miss when they hear this story. They want me to have been furious. They want the version where my hands are shaking with rage. I wasn't angry. I have never once found anger useful in a pressurized tube at 30,000 feet. What I felt sitting there was something much colder and much more professional. Because I had just learned something about Vantore Dynamics that no document in my folder had told me. And I had learned it for free. I had learned that the woman running it revised her assessment of a human being the instant she discovered that human being had leverage over her, which means necessarily mathematically that she also revised it in the other direction, which means somewhere inside that company there were people whose warnings had been weighed not by content, but by rank. So I started asking questions, not as an interrogation. I have no taste for that, and it doesn't work anyway. People close up. What I did instead was hand her back the things she'd already told me, arranged slightly differently. I said she'd mentioned the validation series ran across more than 10,000 operational cycles, which is genuinely impressive for a system at that stage, and I meant it. Then I asked why the final submission to the board drew its conclusions from a subset of roughly 6,000. She said the full set included early development cycles that weren't representative, which is reasonable. It really is. That's a normal thing to do. So I asked which criterion had been used to define representative, and whether that criterion had been set before the data came in, or after. She didn't answer that one. I asked about the anomaly classifications next. In the summary that reached the board, there's a category of events under the heading Operator Anomalies, meaning the system raised an alert and the cause was traced back to human procedure rather than to the software. That's legitimate. That category exists in every system I have ever evaluated in my life. So I asked how many of those events had been reclassified from an earlier label, and how many of the reclassifications had been signed off by an engineer, rather than by a program manager. Where are you getting this? Not a question. She didn't put a question mark on it. I asked one more. I asked why a reliability engineering group inside her own company had formally requested an extended retest, and why that request had been declined. Without a written technical rationale. The cabin was very quiet around us. Somewhere ahead, a child was watching something on a tablet with the volume a notch too high, tinny little cartoon music over and over the same 8 bars. I remember that detail with absolute clarity. I don't know why. The brain keeps strange souvenirs. Celeste Vantore sat with her hands flat on her tray table. Both of them, palms down, fingers spread slightly, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her yet. It was fear, but it was fear wearing a very good suit. None of that is in the public materials. That's correct, I said. Then where did you get it? And I told her the truth, which was that people who do the kind of work I do tend to read the pages that chief executives skip. She wanted to know if I'd planned it. She actually asked me that. Whether the seat had been arranged. Whether the whole flight was some kind of setup engineered to rattle her before the meeting. And this is the least dramatic and most important fact in the entire story. I did not know she would be on that airplane. I did not know what she looked like. I book my own travel. I pay for it out of my own fee. And I chose that flight 9 days earlier because it was $14 cheaper than the one before it. $14. That's it. That's the whole conspiracy. The seat beside mine was assigned by a computer that has never heard of either one of us. And then I said the part I think she found hardest. I said that in the 90 minutes since she sat down, she had told me the deal size, the pricing structure, her position on a phased rollout, her opinion of her own legal review, her opinion of engineers, and her opinion of men who fly in the back of the airplane. I had asked her for none of it, not one word. Everything she had handed me, she'd handed me, because she believed the person beside her did not matter enough to be careful around. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I suppose that's fair." Somewhere over eastern Washington, I decided to tell her the part she had a right to know. Because I don't believe in ambushing people. Not even people who have spent an hour making it perfectly clear they'd ambush me without a second thought. 24 days before that flight, a reliability engineer at Vantore Dynamics had used her company's formal technical escalation channel to transmit an unfiltered data log to the review group at the airline. Her name was Dana Okafor. She was 29 years old, and she did it correctly. That's what I need you to understand. She did not leak it to a journalist. She did not post it anywhere. She did not go around her leadership in secret. She used the exact mechanism that exists in the contract between those two companies precisely so that findings can move when they need to move. And here's what matters most. Dana Okafor never accused anyone of fraud. She never used the word, not once in 19 pages. Her position was narrower than that, and much, much harder to dismiss. She demonstrated that the data set presented to the board had excluded a specific cluster of unfavorable results, and that the exclusion had not been documented with any technical justification an outside evaluator could test. That's not a crime. In a lot of companies, that isn't even unusual. But when the system you're selling is the one that decides whether a piece of ground equipment gets pulled before it fails with a fuel truck or a jet bridge, or a power cart sitting under a loaded aircraft, the difference between a documented exclusion and an undocumented one is not a detail. It's the entire job. I was the person assigned to verify her claim. That's why I was on that airplane. With a folder of raw logs I'd spent 19 days working through. On my way to give a board of directors an answer. I watched Celeste Vantore's face while I said the name, and I saw it land. She remembered Dana Okafor. She remembered her very well, though not for anything Dana had built. She remembered her as the young engineer who had stood up in a quarterly review the previous spring and started walking a room full of executives through a variance chart that nobody had asked to see. And she remembered exactly what she'd said to make it stop. She told me this on the airplane. She did not have to. Nobody made her. I think she said it because she was already assembling her defense and had not yet realized that the sentence was the indictment, 31 people in that room. And Celeste Vantore had looked at a 29-year-old woman holding a chart and said, "When I want an opinion from engineering, I'll ask for one." The cartoon music was still playing 2 rows up, the same 8 bars, and at 30,000 feet somewhere over the dry brown middle of Washington state, I watched a woman understand for the first time all at once, with no exit anywhere in the room, that the person she had silenced in front of 31 witnesses was the only human being in her entire building who had been trying to save her. She didn't say anything for a long time after that. Long enough that the cartoon music finally stopped and the child fell asleep, and somebody's mother reached over and slid the tablet out of small hands without waking them. Long enough that Margie came back through with the second service and looked at the 2 of us. One glance the whole aisle, the way women who've worked 38 years read a row and decided not to ask if we wanted anything. That's a skill. Knowing when not to offer coffee. Nobody teaches it. Then Celeste said, "It isn't a defect." Her voice had changed again. 3rd time in 90 minutes, and this one wasn't a performance. "The architecture is sound. My CTO could take you through it line by line, and you'd agree with him." I said I probably would. Which surprised her. I watched it surprise her. So I told her the thing I actually believe, and I'm going to tell it to you the same way I told it to her, because it's the closest thing I have to a religion. Software defects are ordinary. Every serious system has them. Every single one. If a vendor sits across a table from me and tells me their system has no defects, I don't write that down as good news. I write it down as a lie I haven't found yet. Defects are Tuesday. That's not the problem. The problem is what happens in the days between when somebody finds one and when somebody senior hears about it. Because here's what I've watched happen over and over in 4 countries, and I don't know how many hangars. A young engineer finds something. She's careful about it. She's more careful than she needs to be because she's 29, and she knows exactly how the room will look at her. So she runs it again and again. She stays late. She builds the chart 3 different ways, so nobody can say she picked the flattering one. And then she walks it into a meeting. And somebody with a bigger title makes one remark. Not a cruel one necessarily. Sometimes it's just tired. Sometimes it's just a person who's been in 6 meetings and wants the 7th to end. And here's what nobody understands about that moment. The remark doesn't land on her. It lands on the 40 people watching. Because 31 people were in that room in the spring, and every single one of them went back to their desk having learned something. Not about variance charts, about the building. They learned that bad news is a career risk, and an organization that learns that does not stop producing bad news. It just stops delivering it upward. And then the chief executive stands in front of a board of directors with a set of beautiful numbers, and genuinely does not know she's lying. Celeste turned her head and looked at me. Full on, not the glance, the whole face. And she said the thing that took the floor out from under me. "Have you never stayed quiet?" Okay, so here's where I have to stop and tell you something about myself. And I'd rather not. And I'm going to. Going to anyway, because I have spent 8 years being very careful about who gets to be the hero of this story, and it was never going to be me. You've been listening to me for a while now. Man in a 9-year-old coat. Reads the appendix. Pays for his own seat. Doesn't take the bait. Very restrained. Very principled. I've been enjoying that honestly. It's a good coat to wear. But there's a part of Lantern I've skipped every single time I've told this story. I skipped it at dinner parties. I skipped it in a deposition once technically by answering a slightly different question than the one I'd been asked. So let me just say it. I knew. For 6 weeks. I knew before anyone. I was 34 years old, and 11 years into a career I loved, and I found the pattern on a Thursday in January, in a hangar in Ohio, in a data set nobody had asked me to look at, and I knew what it was. I want that on the record. There was no ambiguity. I did not have a hunch. I had a distribution that could not be explained by anything except the thing it was explained by. And I sat in a folding chair in a cold hangar, and I looked at my own screen, and I felt my stomach go. And then I went home, and I made dinner, and I did not say anything. I told myself it was diligent. That's the beautiful word. Diligence. I told myself I needed a second data set. I told myself I needed to rule out a sensor calibration issue, which fine, that's a real thing. That's a legitimate step, and I ran it, and it took 4 days. The other 38 days were not diligence. The other 38 days were arithmetic, because I was 34. Because I had a mortgage in a market where mortgages had gotten stupid. Because my wife Delphine was a school counselor, and school counselors are magnificent, and they are not paid magnificently, and because we had a 6-year-old. And because, and here it is. Here's the actual sentence. Here's the one I don't say. Because I liked being liked in that building. I liked being the guy they called. I liked walking into a room and having 3 people say my name before I got to the coffee. That's not a small thing. That's not nothing. I had spent 11 years building it, and I was not in a hurry to set it on fire over a chart. So I waited. And while I waited, somebody else didn't. His name was Gil Halloran. I was 56 years old. A mechanic line maintenance, second shift. The kind of man who could hear a bearing going in a running engine and tell you which one. He didn't have my access. He didn't have my data. He didn't have a single one of my 19 columns. What he had was his hands, and 30 years of them, and the fact that he'd pulled the same component twice in 5 weeks, and it had come out looking wrong both times. And he went to his supervisor, and then he went above his supervisor. And then, because he was a stubborn son of a gun who did not know how to read a room, and God bless him for it, he wrote a letter. They didn't fire him. Nobody ever fires anybody. That's not how it works. And if you're waiting for the villain to hand you a termination letter, you will wait your whole life. What they did was reassign him. Different shift. Different facility, 40 minutes farther out. A role that was technically lateral and technically fine and technically nothing you could point to. And they let it be known, not in writing, never in writing, that Gil had gotten emotional about something outside his lane. He took the transfer for 5 months. Then he took early retirement at 56 with a pension calculated on a number that was lower than it should have been, and he went home. 6 weeks after I found it, I finally opened my mouth. And you know what happened? I was a hero. That's the part. That's the joke. That's the thing I've been carrying in my chest like a stone for 8 years. Because by the time I spoke, I had a complete data set and a clean methodology and 19 columns of proof, and I walked into a room and said the same thing Gil Halloran had said in a hallway, and they pulled 41 aircraft off the line inside of 2 weeks. He said it first. He said it with nothing but his hands to back him up, and it cost him his career. I said it second, from behind a wall of evidence, after I'd made sure I couldn't be touched. And they thanked me. Delphine is the reason I said it at all. I've never told anyone that. Not the whole way through. She found the folder on the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. I'd left it out, which I never did. Which I think, looking back from a distance of 8 years and 1 funeral, I think I left it out on purpose. I think some part of me wanted to be caught. She read maybe 4 pages. She didn't understand the columns. She understood my face. And she didn't yell. Delphine never yelled, which was so much worse. She just sat down across from me in her robe at 2 in the morning, and she asked me one question. She said, when she's older, and she asks you what you did. That's it. That's the whole question. She didn't even finish it. Delphine died 6 years ago. Cancer. Fast as those things go, which is the mercy people tell you about. And it is one. And it also means you get 11 weeks to say everything. And I have thought about that kitchen table maybe 4,000 times since. Because I did not become a safety advisor out of principle. I became one because I owed somebody. 2 somebodies. And one of them is dead, and one of them is 64 now and living in Ohio, and doesn't know I still send the Christmas card. I told Celeste Van Torre all of it. Not that long a version. Shorter. Flatter. But all of it. The 6 weeks, the calibration excuse, the hangar in Ohio, Gil Halloran, the transfer, the pension. And when I finished, she said, "Why would you tell me that?" Which was a very good question, and I only had a bad answer. I said, because I'm about to hold you to a standard I did not meet at 34. And you should get to know that before I do it. She looked at me for a while, and then she said quietly, not unkindly, and it took me a second to hear what was underneath it. You would have made a very expensive mistake in my company. Which was, I realized about 4 seconds later, the single most honest thing she'd said to me all morning, because she meant it as a criticism, and she was describing herself. We were 40 minutes out from Seattle when my phone buzzed. I'd broken my own rule and turned the data back on because it was the last leg, and I wanted to check whether the meeting time had moved. It was the airline's council. Text, not a call. 6 words. Okafor was suspended this morning. Call. I don't know how long I sat there before I moved. Long enough that Margie came past twice. You know that thing, where you're carrying a full cup and someone bumps you, and there's a half second where you know it's going to spill, and there is absolutely nothing your hands can do about it. That. I called from the airplane's terrible Wi-Fi, which took 2 attempts and made everything sound like it was coming from inside a coffee can, and I got maybe 90 seconds of information. Dana Okafor. Suspended with pay. Pending a compliance review, which is a phrase I want to translate for you, because it sounds neutral, and it is not neutral. Pending a compliance review means you are not fired, so you cannot sue us, and you are not working, so you cannot look at anything, and you will sit in your apartment for somewhere between 4 and 14 weeks. While your name does lapse around a building, you're no longer allowed to enter. That's what it means. 29 years old. But that wasn't the part. Here's the part. Vantor Dynamics did not know she had sent it. The escalation channel is anonymized at transmission. That's the entire architectural point of it. That's why it exists. The vendor sees that a submission occurred. The vendor does not see the submitter. It's in the contract in 3 places, and I could recite the clause numbers in my sleep. So somebody told them. And it did not come from Vantore. It came from the other side of the table. It came from inside the airline. I sat back in seat 32A, and I ran it the way you run anything. Because who benefits? Because there's a board vote in a few hours on a $240 million authorization, and there's exactly one document standing in front of it. And if the person who produced that document can be recategorized from reliability engineer with a finding to disgruntled employee under review, then the document doesn't have to be argued with. It just has to be discounted. And you don't need to win that argument. You only need to make it available. Which meant somebody on that board or close to it wanted this to go through. Which meant when I walked into that room, at least one person sitting at that table was not going to be listening to my findings. They were going to be waiting for a way around them. And I did not know which one. I put the phone face down. My hands were not steady, which I noticed, which annoyed me. And I did the math I had been carefully not doing for 8 years. Because here's what happens to a person who reports something and then gets suspended. She becomes a story about herself. She stops being a woman who found a pattern in humidity band failure data and becomes a woman who had issues, who wasn't a team player, who had that thing with her manager. Remember, and it doesn't matter that none of it's true because it doesn't have to be true to work. It only has to be available. That's what happened to Gil Halloran. And I watched it happen to Gil Halloran from a comfortable distance while I finished my data set. And I told myself at 34 in a warm house that it was diligence. Not this time. Not this one. Celeste was watching me. She'd heard my half of the call. There was no version where she hadn't. And this matters for everything that comes after she looked genuinely surprised. Not performed. I've spent 20 years reading faces across tables for a living, and I'd put money on it. On it, she did not know. She had not ordered it. Whatever else that woman had done, she had not done that. Which was in a way that took me the rest of the descent to work out so much worse. Because it meant her company had done it without her. Because it meant someone in her building had looked at the situation, understood the culture they were operating in, and correctly predicted what she would want. Nobody had to ask her. That's what a culture is. It's the thing that happens when you're not in the room. She said one word. Mine? I told her no. I told her I didn't think so. And I watched her sit with the fact that the alternative was not better. Margie came down the aisle a few minutes later, collecting cups, and she stopped at row 32 for the second time. She didn't say anything. She put a paper cup of tea on my tray table. I hadn't ordered tea. There was no tea service on that flight. God only knows where in that galley she found it, or what she had to move to get it. She just set it down. One hand on the seat back, a look that lasted about half a second, and she went on up the aisle, and I sat there with both hands around a paper cup at 30,000 feet, 40 minutes, out from the worst 4 hours of my professional life. And something in my chest came loose in a way I was absolutely not prepared for. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about being the man who does the right thing. It's lonely as hell. You do it alone, and you carry it alone, and everybody assumes you're fine, because you look fine, and the whole architecture of your dignity depends on nobody asking. And then, a 61-year-old woman with 38 years in the aisle walks past and hands you a cup of tea you didn't ask for, and doesn't say a word about it, and doesn't wait for thanks. Because she saw your face. Because she knew. Because that is what women like that have been doing their entire lives in kitchens and hospital corridors and airplane galleys, without ever once being thanked properly for it. And I want to say right here, if you are one of them, somebody noticed. I noticed. We started down over the Cascades a few minutes later. Weather, like the captain said. The airplane bucked twice, and everybody's stomach went, and then it settled. And Celeste Vantore turned to me with a completely different look on her face than any of the ones she'd worn so far. She had a few hours until that vote, and she had just realized she was going to need me. There is a phase people go through, and I have seen it enough times now to know it on sight. It always arrives disguised as collaborations. It never announces itself. It never says, I am about to try to buy you. It says, let's solve this together. It says, I think we want the same thing here. It leans in. It gets warm. It uses your first name for the first time in 2 hours. And I want to be fair to Celeste Vantore, because I'm going to be very unfair to her later. She was good at it. She was so good at it that for about 90 seconds, I wanted to say yes. 2 hours, she said. We were down through the first layer of cloud. Gray outside the window, then grayer, then a smear of Puget Sound that came and went so fast, you'd have missed it if you blinked. 2 hours between the wheels touching in that room. Do you know what my team can do in 2 hours? I said I had some idea. They can pull the complete cycle set, all 10,000. They can reconstruct every classification decision with a name and a date attached to it. Her hands were moving now. This was the real her, I think, not the woman at the gate. This one, the builder. We put the whole thing on the table. We don't wait to be asked. We get in front of it. And I told her honestly that was exactly the right instinct. Because it was. She should absolutely do that. Every part of that was correct. Then help me shape it. And there it was. You understand the technical material better than anyone I can reach this morning. True. You know how that board reads. You know what Halverson listens for. Also true. And a joint presentation demonstrates good faith in a way nothing else possibly could. Which I'll give her. This is not a stupid argument. It's actually a pretty good argument. It's the kind of argument that has worked on a great many people, and I'd bet my house it had worked on a great many people, for her specifically, over 23 years. I told her I couldn't touch it. You could sit in a room and look at columns of numbers, Emmett. I told her that if I sat in a room and looked at those columns with her team before that vote, then I wasn't the independent reviewer anymore. I was a co-author. And a co-author cannot audit his own work. Nobody would know. I let that one sit for a second. Because there it was. The whole thing out loud in 5 words. Nobody would know. And I said I would. She changed tack. She's quick. I want that on the record too. Whatever else that woman's mind moves. She said, then let's talk about after. And this is where she did it beautifully. She did not put a number on the table like a bribe. She didn't insult me. She was much too skilled for that. She said Vantore Dynamics had needed an independent standards function for 3 years and had never built one because she'd never found a person she'd actually listened to. She said she'd build it around me. Direct reporting line to her. Charter written by me. Authority to halt a submission. And then, almost as an afterthought, the way you mentioned the weather. Whatever the airline is paying you for 3 weeks, we'd be at a multiple of it. Standing, annual. And then she said the sentence. A man raising a daughter alone should think seriously about what that kind of stability would mean. She said it kindly. That was the worst part. There was no edge on it at all. She said it the way an aunt says it. She said it the way somebody says a thing they believe is generous. And I sat there, in seat 32A, with my hands around a cold paper cup, and I thought, You have now used my daughter twice. 2 hours ago, Ren was Exhibit A. Ren was the evidence. Ren was the reason a man over 40 flies in the back of the airplane and has a ceiling and tells himself it was wisdom. And now Ren was leverage. Same child. Same 14-year-old girl who had texted me 5 words that morning about something that couldn't wait. Weapon, then prize. And I don't think I genuinely do not think she noticed she had done both. That's not me being generous. That's the diagnosis. That's the whole thing I'd been trying to tell her for 2 hours, and she had just performed it live in a descending aircraft with no idea she was doing it. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you again, and I'm getting tired of how often this story requires that. Because I want to tell you I felt nothing. I want to tell you the refusal was automatic. That's the version where I come out clean. It wasn't automatic. There was a number on my phone. 12 days before that flight, a letter had come. Actual paper. Which is how you know it's serious. Now nobody mails you anything anymore, unless they want you to hold it. Ren had been accepted into a 6-week summer engineering intensive university program. They take 30 kids from the whole country, and she was one of them. And she'd applied without telling me because she didn't want me to be disappointed if it didn't happen. 14 years old and already managing my feelings. I'd like a word with whoever taught her that. It was me. Obviously, it was me. Tuition room materials, $11,400. Deposit due in August. And I want you to understand exactly what my life looks like. Because I think people hear independent advisor and picture something it is not. I have no salary. I have engagements. Some years there are 9, and some years there are 4. And the 4 year is the reason I do not own a nice car. I turned down a retainer in the spring, good money, quarterly, the kind that lets a man sleep because taking it would have meant I could never again evaluate anything that company touched. And they touch a lot. I turned it down, and I felt good about it for 1 entire afternoon. Then that letter arrived, and I'd looked at this number 3 times on a phone with a cracked corner, and I still had not figured out how I was going to do it. I had a plan involving the truck, and a second mortgage conversation I was dreading, and neither of those was a plan. They were both just delays wearing plan costumes. So when Celeste Vantore said the word stability, it landed. I'm not going to pretend it didn't land. For about 90 seconds, I sat in that seat, and I let myself see it. The whole thing. Direct report. Charter. A number that would make $11,400 a rounding error instead of a crisis. And a daughter who would never have to know that her father had to think about it. You want to know what pulled me out of it. Not principle. A kitchen table. 2 in the morning, 8 years ago, a woman in a robe who didn't finish her sentence. I said no. I said it without heat, because there wasn't any decision to make. Once I'd stopped pretending there was, I said I was retained by the airline to evaluate your company's proposal. If I accept any consideration from you now, or in 6 months, or in a handshake, nobody writes down. It doesn't just look like a conflict of interest. It is one. You'd be under NDA. It would be structured months out. I told her that the moment I take anything from her, my report becomes worthless. And if my report is worthless, then Dana Okafor got suspended for nothing. And 19 days of my life in those logs were a hobby. The only thing I actually sell is whether or not my findings can be trusted. I have exactly one of those. It does not grow back. She took it better than I expected. She nodded. Once. And she turned and looked out the window at the cloud deck coming up to meet us, and neither of us said anything for a while. And for about 90 seconds, we were just two tired people descending into Seattle. That happened. I want to include it, because the version of this story, where she's a monster all the way through, is a more satisfying story, and it is not the one I was in. Then she said without turning around, "I was 27 once." I waited, but that was all she said. She didn't finish it. She let the sentence just sit there, half-built, and then she straightened her collar with 2 fingers the way I'd watched her do at gate B14 4 hours earlier. And I thought, And I filed it exactly where I'd filed the phone call to her mother. Which is to say, nowhere useful. Which is to say, I had every single piece of that woman in my hands by then, and I did not assemble them until she assembled them for me in front of 12 people a few hours later. So much for reading faces for a living. We landed at 11:52 on a Friday. Long taxi. That endless Seattle taxi where you can see the terminal for 6 minutes before you get to it. And people did the thing. People do. The seatbelt lights are still on, and 40% of the aircraft stands up anyway. And Margie's voice came over the PA, sounding like a woman who has said the same sentence 10,000 times and has decided to enjoy it. Celeste didn't stand. She sat there with her hands in her lap, and I realized she was rehearsing. You could see it. Her jaw was moving very slightly. She was running the room. Then just before the door, Margie stopped at row 32 for the third and last time. She had a folded piece of paper in her hand. "From the lady in the lavender," she said. "Seat 9C. She got up to use the lavatory and asked me to make sure you got it. Ruth, and I want to tell you what was on that paper, because I have it still in the glove compartment of a truck I did not end up having to sell. It said, 'Thank you for the bag, young man. My granddaughter is marrying a man I don't care for, but he lifted my suitcase at the curb without being asked. So perhaps I'm wrong about him. People show you who they are in the small things.' Safe travels. Ruth Pemberton, 84. 84 years old." Wrote that on the back of a boarding pass with the little pen from the crossword. People show you who they are in the small things. I read it twice standing in the aisle with a suitcase in my hand and my chest doing something complicated, and I put it in my coat pocket. The 9-year-old coat. The one with the elbows. And Celeste Vantore watched me read it. She didn't ask what it said. I've thought about that. I think by then she'd stopped asking questions she didn't want the answers to. The door opened, and there was a man standing on the jet bridge in a charcoal suit with a Meridian Pacific credential on a lanyard scanning faces as they came off the aircraft. He was doing that thing where you're trying to look casual and you're absolutely not. Chin up, eyes moving. And when he found mine, his whole posture changed. His name was Peter Manick. He ran operations integration for the airline, and I'd spoken to him twice on the phone and never met him in my life. He came forward and put out his hand, and did not look at anybody else on that jet bridge. "Mr. Thorne." I shook it. Halverson's holding the room. And then he said the sentence, "The board will not vote until they have your final assessment. He asked me to tell you personally they'll wait as long as you need." Celeste Vantore was standing 3 feet behind me, leather bag on her shoulder, coat over her arm, and she heard every single word of it. I introduced them, because it would have been cruel not to, and because I have never once been able to make cruelty work in my hands, and because, honestly, because I wanted to see it. There was about 1.5 seconds in there where I wanted to see it. Peter shook her hand with the flawless courtesy of a man who has been briefed. He said all the appropriate things. He said the room was ready for her team. She said the appropriate things back. Her voice was perfect. Her face was not. And that right there, on a jet bridge in Seattle, at 11:58 in the morning, that was the moment. Not the captain's greeting, which only made her curious. Not the 12 words in the appendix, which only made her uneasy. It was standing on carpet that smells the same in every airport in America, hearing a senior executive of the company she'd flown out to sell to explain that a board of directors was sitting in a room holding a $240 million vote, waiting on the opinion of the man she had spent 2 hours and 41 minutes explaining the world to. I didn't say anything to her about it. Not a word. Not a look. I picked up my small gray suitcase, the one with the wheel that sings, and I walked up the jet bridge, and I did not look back. Because there was nothing back there I wanted. But I'll tell you what I was actually thinking walking up that ramp. I wasn't thinking about her. I was thinking about a 29-year-old woman sitting in an apartment somewhere in a city she'd moved to for a job on a Friday morning, not allowed to open her work email. And I was thinking about how somebody inside the airline, the good guys, supposedly my client, the people paying my fee, had put her name in front of the company she reported. And I did not know which one. And in about 2 hours, I was going to walk into a room and stand in front of 12 people, and at least one of them had already decided how this was going to end. I stopped at a coffee place in Concourse C, sat down, opened the laptop with the dent, and I did the last thing I do before every single one of these, which is not technical at all. I read Dana Okafor's original submission one more time. All 19 pages. Not the data. I knew the data, the prose. Because you can hear a person in how they write when they're frightened. She hedged 4 times in 19 pages. 4. It is possible that. This may warrant. I may be missing context. And every hedge was in the exact place where a 29-year-old woman knows the room is about to look at her. She had built the chart 3 different ways. She said so in a footnote in a sentence that broke my heart a little. I ran the analysis using 3 separate binning methods so that the result would not depend on my choices. 29 years old. I closed the laptop. I looked at my phone, cracked corner, 4%, battery, 1, unread from Ren, that said don't forget Saturday, with 3 exclamation points. And I texted back, wouldn't dare. Then I stood up, and I picked up the gray suitcase, and I went to find a taxi. Meridian Pacific sits south of the city, with a view of the water, and the lobby is much quieter than people expect. No fountain, no sculpture. Gray carpet, good light, and a receptionist who has worked there long enough to know everybody's name, and to pretend she doesn't. Celeste Vantore got there 20 minutes ahead of me with 4 people from her team. And by the time I walked in, she had rebuilt herself completely. That's a real skill, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. 2 hours and 41 minutes of the worst airplane ride of her professional life. A jet bridge that took the floor out from under her, and there she was in that lobby, with the coat off and the deck loaded, and her CTO at her right hand, moving through the space with the same weatherfront certainty she'd brought to gate B14 that morning. I heard her in the corridor telling her people to run it exactly as planned. No changes. No preemptive concessions. Somewhere between the jet bridge and that lobby, she had decided to put the armor back on. And I understood it. I did. It was the only thing that had ever worked for her. She believed a 90-year commercial relationship and a company of her scale would carry more weight in that room than a technical memorandum from one outside advisor in a bad coat. She believed the deal had gravity of its own. I came in last. Same coat. Same laptop, with the dent. No team, no entourage, Nobody carrying anything for me because there was nothing to carry. And Sterling Halverson was standing near the head of the table talking to two directors. 63 years old. Chairman of that board, for 9 of them. The least theatrical, powerful person I have ever worked with in my life. A man who has never once raised his voice in my presence and has never once needed to. He stopped mid-sentence, crossed the room, and shook my hand before he greeted anybody else in it. "Emmett, thank you for coming. Take whatever time you need." Then he turned and welcomed Celeste Vantore warmly, correctly, and offered her the chair at his left. And I watched her absorb the order of those two things. Because in a room like that, sequence is not decoration. Sequence is information. Every person at that table understood exactly what they'd just seen. And so did she. And she sat down with a composure that must have cost her more than anything else she did that day. We started at 2 o'clock with her presentation, because that was the agenda, and Sterling Halverson does not rearrange agendas to make a point. Her team was good. I need to say that clearly, because what comes next will sound like I'd made up my mind, and I hadn't. The architecture was genuinely impressive. Her CTO knew that Material Cold answered 2 hard questions from a director without flinching. The projected savings across an operation that size were not fantasy. Through all of it, I said nothing about the flight. Not one word. Not one look. I had no intention of ever mentioning it, and I would not be telling you any of this now if the consequences had stayed private. But I could see what the silence was doing to her. She kept glancing at me between slides. Waiting. Because in her model of the world, that's what a man in my position does with an advantage. He spends it. He waits for the best moment, and he spends it in front of witnesses. And the not knowing was worse for her than any accusation would have been. She was preparing a defense against a weapon I was never going to pick up. They finished at 3:14. Halverson turned to me and asked for the independent assessment. I gave it in 19 minutes, and there was nothing in it about a seat assignment. I said the Vantore predictive architecture was technically credible, and in several respects ahead of anything else available at that price. I said the concept was sound. I said I did not believe anyone had built it in bad faith, and I meant that. And I looked at her CTO when I said it, because he was the one who needed to hear it. Then I put the logs up. I showed the full 10,000 cycle series next to the 6,000 cycle subset the board had received. And I showed that the excluded cluster was not randomly distributed. It was concentrated. Tight. In one specific band of operating conditions, high ambient humidity sustained, which describes roughly 1/3 of that airline's ground operations network. The room got very quiet. I showed the reclassified alerts and the absence of engineering sign-off. I showed the declined retest request and the blank space where a technical rationale should have been. And then I said the harder part. The part most advisors leave out because it isn't strictly technical and it isn't strictly ours to say. I said the data problem was recoverable. I said the governance problem was not. Not yet. I told that board that a supplier organization in which a documented engineering concern can be publicly dismissed by its chief executive and then quietly reclassified downstream by people who correctly guessed what she'd want is an organization whose future data cannot be relied upon. No matter how good the engineering underneath it is, you would not be buying a system. You'd be buying 9 years of that company's judgment about which results to show you. My recommendation was to freeze authorization, not cancel. Freeze. And to retain a limited pilot on 11 units contingent on 3 conditions. 1. An independent audit of the complete validation set. 2. Full restoration and documentation of every excluded result. 3. And I said this one slowly, because I wanted it in the minutes. A formal, enforceable protection for the internal engineering staff who raised the original concern, so that nobody at that company ever again pays a price for being right early. I sat down, and that's when it happened. Vantore's outside counsel stood up. Her name was Ines Vargo, and she was very good at her job, and what she did next was not dirty. It was not dirty at all. It was exactly what I would have done in her chair. She'd spent 3 weeks doing precisely what I do, which is read the things people assume nobody reads. I'd have hired her. She said the board should be aware of the professional history of the reviewer they were relying upon. And she opened a folder. 8 years ago. A hangar in Ohio. A pattern identified in January. An internal report filed 6 weeks later. And a line maintenance mechanic who raised the same concern first through a supervisor and was transferred to a facility 40 minutes away and took early retirement at 56. She read the dates out loud. Just the dates. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. She let 12 people do the subtraction themselves in the silence. 6 weeks. Now, I want to tell you what happens in a man's body at that moment. Because you feel it in the back of your neck first. Then your hands go cold, and there's this incredible pull, I mean physical, to explain. To say the word calibration. To say I needed a second data set, which is true, which is technically completely true. And I opened my mouth to say it. I did. I got about half a breath in. And then I thought about a footnote, so that the result would not depend on my choices. Sitting in an apartment right now, not allowed to open her email. So I stood up, and I said she's right. I told them the whole thing. 6 weeks, not 5, not several. 6. I told them I was 34 years old, and I had a mortgage and a 6-year-old, and I liked being liked in that building, and I was not in a hurry to set that on fire over a chart. I said Gil Halloran's name. I said it twice, so it would be in the record twice. And I told them that a man with 30 years in his hands and no data at all said it first, and lost his career for it. And that I said it. Second from behind a wall of evidence after I'd made sure I couldn't be touched. And they thanked me. Then I said the only thing I had. I said I know exactly what that culture looks like from the inside. Because I was part of it. I'm not standing here as a man who has never been afraid. I'm standing here as a man who was afraid for 6 weeks and who has spent 8 years trying to make sure the next Gil Halloran doesn't have to be braver than I was. That's not a credential, but it's the reason I read the appendices. Sterling Halverson did not move. Ines Vargo sat down. And the room did that thing where nobody knows who's supposed to speak next. Then Celeste Vantore stood up, and I braced. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, because I had just handed her a loaded weapon in front of her own counsel, and if she wanted to finish me, the door was open and the lights were on. She said, I'd like to say something. It isn't a defense. Halverson nodded once. She said I was 27. And I felt the whole morning turn over. She told them she'd been a reliability engineer at a company that no longer exists, that she'd found a problem in a thermal management system and rebuilt the analysis 3 times because she knew what the room would do, and that she stood up in a quarterly review with a chart nobody had asked to see, and a man with a bigger title had looked at her in front of, she said, somewhere around 30 people. She'd stopped being able to remember the exact number, and said that when he wanted an opinion from engineering, he would ask for one. Nobody breathed. because half that table had already heard the same sentence in my assessment 40 minutes earlier, attributed to her. She said she left 11 months later, started her own company with 9 people in a leased warehouse. She said she was the only woman in the room for the first 12 years, and she learned very early that hesitation reads as weakness, and that if she had ever once said, "I'm not sure," out loud, she would have been finished. She said she'd promised herself she would never become that man. Then she stopped, and she looked at the table, not at anyone, and she said, "I don't know when it happened." That's what she said. Not "I'm sorry." Not yet. That came later in a corridor to a different person, and it isn't mine to describe. She said, "I don't know when it happened," and I believe her. That's the horror of it. There was no morning she woke up and decided. It happened at the speed a coastline erodes. One meeting, one tired remark, one when I want an opinion from engineering at a time, until the armor that got her into the room was the exact thing keeping her from seeing what was in it. And standing there, I thought about a woman at a gate in Denver, 4 meters away from me, asking somebody very gently whether they'd brought the green blanket. Both of those people were her. She had just never been allowed to bring the second one to work. I said one thing to her that day that was not strictly professional. I said it quietly because it did not need volume. I told her, "You didn't lose this because you disrespected me. You lost it because you disrespect everyone you've decided you'll never need. A young engineer with a variance chart. A room you talk over. An 84-year-old woman with a canvas bag at a gate. A man in a coach seat." I said I was on the receiving end of it for 2 hours, and it cost me exactly nothing, because I got off that airplane and went to work. Dinah Okafor was on the receiving end of it in front of 31 people. And that has now cost your company $250 million, because after that day, nobody in your building was ever going to walk a difficult chart into a room again. Sterling Halverson let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he did the thing that ended it. He said the board had received the escalated technical material 3 weeks before that morning's flight, through the formal channel established in the parties' own agreement, and that my engagement had been authorized on a date he then read aloud from the record. He said it without any edge at all. He wasn't scoring a point. He was closing an exit. Because he did not want that woman leaving the building carrying a story that would let her fix nothing. And then he said the second thing. And this one I did not see coming. He said the board had also been informed that morning that the identity of the submitting engineer had been disclosed to the vendor, and that the disclosure had not originated with the vendor. He said an outside review of that disclosure had been opened before this meeting began, that it would be handled by counsel reporting to the board, not to management. And he said one more sentence, and he looked at nobody in particular when he said it, which is how I knew he was looking at somebody in particular. "Whoever did that," he said, "should understand that the review will be thorough." 2 seats down, a man in a blue tie put his pen down and did not pick it up again. I'm not going to name him. I never confirmed it, and I'm not in the business of saying things I can't put 19 columns behind. But he abstained. The vote was 7-4. Not unanimous. I want you to know that, because the version where the room rises as one is a nicer story. And it isn't what happened. 4 people at that table looked at $250 million in savings and a 9-year relationship and decided the risk was manageable. 4 people. Reasonable people. Who I'd have a beer with. That's what these rooms are actually like. Authorization frozen. Limited pilot preserved on 11 units under the 3 conditions. All 3, including the third one. As I was gathering my things, she came over to me near the door. Her team was already in the corridor. She asked me one question, and I don't think she asked it to be clever. She wanted to know why a man with that kind of influence flies in a coach seat. And I told her the truth, which has 2 parts. The first part is procedural. I pay my own travel when I do independent work because the moment a company buys my seat, that seat starts having an opinion. I keep every receipt in a tin box on a shelf in my kitchen. 8 years of them. If anyone ever asks, I don't have to explain. I can just hand them the box. The second part is simpler. I don't need an expensive chair to know who I am, and the day I do, I'll have already stopped being useful at this job. She asked if that was something I'd learned somewhere. I said it was something I was trying to teach. I said my daughter is 14, and the only thing I have ever really wanted her to understand is that a person's worth does not change according to the seat they happen to be sitting in, and that includes her own. Then I picked up my suitcase, and I left. And I did not feel any of the things people assume I felt. There was no triumph in it. There is never any triumph in watching a capable person discover what her own habits have cost her. I made my flight home that night. Middle seat 34B because I booked it late. Sat next to a man who fell asleep before we left the gate and stayed asleep the whole way to Denver, which was after that day, close to a gift. Ren was waiting up. Saturday, 10:40 at night, I'd landed too late Friday to do anything but drop my bag and sleep, and she'd made me wait a full day for it, out of what I can only describe as spite. Kitchen lights on. And there was a thing on the table under a dish towel like it was a pie. She pulled the towel off. It was a pneumatic manifold, hand-built, out of hardware store fittings and a bike pump, and about 9 feet of tubing for a regional competition I had absolutely known about and had absolutely forgotten the date of. It failed, she said. Not sadly, just reporting. Where 11th pressure cycle, the elbow joint on the left branch. And then she handed me a notebook. Spiral bound, 99 cents. Her handwriting, which is terrible, which she gets from me. And on the page in 3 columns, cycle number. Observed pressure. What I think happened, and why. 11 rows. And the last row wasn't a number. The last row was 4 sentences explaining that she'd used the wrong grade of fitting on the left branch, and that she had suspected it on cycle 7, and that she'd kept going anyway because she wanted the run to look good. She wrote that down. 14 years old, and she wrote down the part that made her look bad. I stood in my kitchen at 10:40 at night with a spiral notebook in my hands, and I could not speak for a second. Because I had just spent 19 days and 1 very long airplane ride and 4 hours in a boardroom on a company with 200 employees and a $250 million proposal that could not do what this child did for 99 cents. Record the failure. Say why. Don't hide it. She said, "Dad, it's not that deep." I said it was actually. It was extremely that deep. She said I was being weird. I said I'd been on a long flight. And she got the milk out, and I got the cereal because that's dinner in our house when I come home late, and Delphine would have had opinions about that, and I would have ignored them, and she'd have known I was going to. The rest came in over the following weeks the way these things do. Dana Okafor's suspension was lifted 9 days later. She was invited onto the independent audit team, not as the subject of it. As a member. I've never met her. I want to say that plainly because people assume there's a scene where we shake hands, and it never happened, and I don't expect it will. She wrote me one email. 4 lines. The last line said I wasn't sure anyone read the whole thing. I read it 4 times, and then I sat in my truck in a parking lot for a while. Celeste Van Torre was not destroyed. I want to be clear, because the ending people expect is not the ending that happened. Nobody was arrested. No company collapsed overnight. What she got was slower, and I suspect considerably worse. The largest transaction of her year evaporated on a Friday afternoon. Her own board convened within 2 weeks and asked her to account for how a data set had reached a customer's directors in a condition she could not defend. Her leadership, for the first time in 23 years, became a question instead of an assumption. And she had to sit in a conference room and explain out loud why an engineer she had shamed in public had been the only person in her building willing to put the truth in writing. I heard later from Peter Manick that she stayed in that room a long time after everyone else had gone, standing near the empty chair I'd been sitting in, not looking at anything in particular. And the thing I keep coming back to isn't the part you'd expect. It isn't that she insulted the wrong man. It's that for 2 hours and 41 minutes, she sat 11 inches away from the one person alive who had read every page of what was going wrong inside her own company, who had the complete picture, who had spent 19 days in it, and who would have told her all of it, every word, if she had asked one genuine question. She never asked. She looked at a 9-year-old coat and a cracked phone and a ticket in row 32, and she decided the man attached to them had nothing worth hearing. That decision cost her $240 million. And it wasn't the most expensive decision she made that year. It was only the one where the bill finally arrived. Nobody is going to announce you. Most people who do the right thing do it in a galley or a kitchen or a hallway. There's no captain on the speakers saying your name. There's no room that stands up. You just do it. And you hope somebody's daughter is watching. Because she is. She always is.